British illustrator Helen Stratton was born in Madhya Pradesh in India in 1867, where her father was an army surgeon. Not long after Helen's birth and her father's retirement, the family moved to England and settled in the city of Bath. In 1891 she went to art school in London, and there she first discovered the Art Nouveau movement and was drawn to its organic decorative appeal. And by the time she had completed her studies and begun working, the influence was clear to see. In 1896 her bold imaginative pen and ink illustrations for children's books started to appear, and she had early success with her work on Norman Gale's book Songs for Little People. Large amounts of similar commissions came her way, and she was remarkably prolific. In 1898 she drew over 160 illustrations for Walter Douglas Campbell's Beyond the Border, and only a year later she produced a staggering 400 drawings for a large format edition of the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. Between 1902 and 1903 she had no less than 6 more books published, including what would be the first of 3 separate volumes of the Tales of the Brothers Grimm. She also contributed to a lavish volume of the Arabian Nights stories, where her illustrations appeared alongside those of highly respected illustrators, including William Heath Robinson in 1906. Like Robinson and her other contemporaries, she had necessarily made her reputation with monochrome pen and ink illustration, but following the invention of offset colour lithography, she too went on to produce tonal watercolours for books such as A.G. Herbertson's Heroic Legends in 1908 and Jean Lang's A Book of Myths in 1915. And as was common practice at the time, she also created quite a few books with line illustrations which had spot colours added at printing. In 1911, The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald was published, and a year later its sequel appeared. Both books were immensely popular and reprinted numerous times. After this period of astonishing productivity, Stratton's rate of production slowed somewhat, but she was still creating colour and monochrome illustration into the middle of the 1920s. At that point she went into semi-retirement, with only a handful of books published in the coming decade. Her last published book was 1934's Ronald's Burglar, written by Christine Chandler, and Helen Stratton lived for another quarter of a century, in retirement up to her death in 1961 at the age of 95. Harry Grant Dart was an American humorous illustrator who in his lifetime was widely known for his comical, and occasionally not so comical, takes on what the future might hold. He was born somewhere in America in 1869, and there isn't any record of formal art education, so it's quite likely he was self-taught. He would be far from unique if that was the case. As a young man he worked as a staff artist for the Boston Herald newspaper, followed by a decade at the New York World, rising to become the art editor. Sadly no trace of this early editorial work exists, and it's 1908 when he used his position at the paper to create the comic strip The Explorigator, which was printed in colour and syndicated across the States. This delightful if derivative fantasy was intended to compete with Winsor McCay's Little Nemo in Slumberland series, but it only managed a 14-week run. Nevertheless, the quality of Dart's artwork was the equal of McCay's and every bit as expressive. He tried another strip titled Boys Will Be Boys in 1909, but that also sank without trace quite quickly. But he did have success elsewhere when the first of his astonishingly complex crowd scenes had been published in Life magazine. This and the many others that followed soon after were remarkably popular with the readers, and he became an enduring regular contributor to the magazine. These engrossing, tightly controlled line illustrations were created with pen and ink, and they demonstrated a descriptive ability most of us can only dream of. Not only was he able to create any number of scenarios within the total composition, but he was enviably adept with posing and plausible, almost realistic anatomy. There's no information about it, but I would love to know to what extent he relied on observational drawings and models. As you'd expect, Life's competitors immediately took an interest in his work, and Dart was invited to create similar scenes for Puck magazine. and his work for Puck was reproduced in colour, frequently as double-page spreads. Dart created the foundation of his images in precisely the same way as he did for monochrome, so although washes of colour were applied, it was his inking which did the descriptive modelling and shading. In 1918, Puck folded, but Dart was unfazed and promptly began working for their rival Judge. His comical predictions of the future became a recurring popular theme in his work, and he also created some more serious-minded painterly watercolours for publication in various magazines, including Harper's Weekly. In the 1920s, his illustrations appeared with considerably less frequency, and I don't know if he had taken early retirement or whether the work had simply stopped coming his way. But given the level of his talent, that seems highly unlikely. Whatever the reason, he had created a large amount of what has to be some of the finest comic illustration ever produced, and he died in 1938 at the age of 69. Roger de Valerio was born in the town of Lille in northern France in 1886, and although he studied architecture at the School of Fine Arts in Paris, his first employment was in the art department of the newspaper Le Matin in 1911. In 1917, he began a 7-year period working for the Parisian music publishers Francis Salabert, and in his time there he created stylish illustrated sheet music covers for many of the popular songs of the day. It was this series of daringly non-representational modernist images which established his reputation as a particularly design-conscious illustrator of considerable merit. By 1926, he had risen to the topmost levels of the Parisian illustration hierarchy, and in addition to his ongoing increasing freelance work, he was appointed as an artistic consultant for the prestigious publishing house Devambe. And this collaboration led to the production of a large number of posters, all of which displayed the same visually dynamic sensibility he had demonstrated in his earlier sheet music work. Although all his posters were informed by the stylistic principles of what was by now called Art Deco, he was far from slavish in its use, and his posters were actually quite visually diverse, featuring varying levels of abstraction. Valerio's most commonly used medium was gouache, but he had a similarly eclectic approach to his application of colour, from flat to tonal and textured use of the brush. By the 1930s, de Valerio was one of the most successful poster artists working in Paris, at a time when the city boasted more than its fair share of immense graphic talents, including A.M. Cassandra and Paul Colin. In 1932, he also became the editor of Le Rire magazine, and although this job limited the volume of his own output, he nevertheless found the time and energy to create some of his most assured and dynamic poster work for Air France and other significant clients. In 1940, Valerio had made enough money to retire comfortably to an island off the coast of Brittany, and he managed 11 years there up to his death in 1951 at the relatively young age of 65. American illustrator Keith Ward was born in 1906, somewhere in America, and it seems nothing is known about his early life, family circumstances, or where he studied art, if he studied it at all. Assuming the year of his birth is correct, he would have begun his working life most probably in the later 1920s. And the earliest dated example of his work I could find is the weirdly titled Book Trails for Baby Feet, which was published in 1928 and seems to support this idea. And from that point on, published work by Ward starts to appear quite regularly, so it's at least possible to plot the timeline of his career with reasonable accuracy. In 1930, he illustrated the picture book Jolly Animals by E.R. Gagin, and this book too featured many charming colour images with an undeniable appeal to young readers. The illustrations for the book were created with flat colour, undoubtedly applied in gouache, although that's not verified, which was contained by a descriptive calligraphic black line. Muggin's Mouse was published in 1932, and this book not only had some very attractive imaginative page layouts, but also demonstrated his ability with more tonally applied washes of colour. The book also featured monochrome halftones created the same way. Ward seems to have been particularly prolific at this time, and he also produced 2 volumes of the nonsense rhymes originally written and drawn by Edward Lear the best part of a century earlier. Ward's version successfully updated the book to bring it more in line with mid-20th century children's expectations. He also found time to create many light humorous covers for Child Life magazine over the next few years. With a style and general disposition as good-natured and inoffensive as his, it wasn't surprising that Ward also became a popular choice for advertising work, and a remarkably diverse array of clients made use of his comedic talent. Some of this work veered away from more overt cartoon anatomical principles towards a more representational approach. He used the same painting style in 1940 for the Fun with Dick and Jane book series, and these watercolour wholesome depictions of family life became a virtual template for the more instructional children's books of the later 1940s and 1950s. Ward also put his more realistic approach to use with a series of dramatic monochromes for 1941's Black Stallion, written by Walter Farley. But it was definitely with his more knockabout anthropomorphic animal style that he was at his most distinctive and adept. Arguably his greatest achievement in animal character design was the 1945 book Reynard the Fox. This was another updating of an older European story, and it was produced in collaboration with the writer Harry Owens. Unfortunately, these images were only reproduced as half-tone monochromes, but the body language and facial expressions of his characters was remarkably accomplished and plausible. And there is a perfectly reasonable assertion in various internet sources that these drawings were relied on more than a little in the making of Disney's animal version of Robin Hood in 1973. As a demonstration of Ward's versatility, the Timothy Tiger book he illustrated in the same year was created with ultra-modernist heavy lines and flat spot colour, making it a virtual template for most modern early learner books. Among Ward's more memorable post-war illustrations was his ad campaign for the Borden Dairy Company using the character Elsie the cow, another example of his mastery of anthropomorphism. And his puppy-themed series of comically energetic press ads for Texaco in 1952 may have had no discernible link to selling petrol, but nevertheless they were wildly popular with the American public. It seems that somewhere around the late 1950s, Keith Ward had grown rather tired of commercial illustration, and like so many others in this series, he retired and occasionally painted landscapes just for the sake of it. And he died in 2000, somewhere in America, at the age of 94. And that's another quartet whose memory should be better preserved, and hopefully I'll see you next time around. Bye for now.